Okay, today we're going to have a discussion about with Dave Johnston, of course, our regular, and Professor Nick Evans, and we're going to be talking about so who are the first Australians? So thinking about how far it goes back and so on and so forth. And we've also got Rachel Wood, who is zooming in, and she's a radiocarbon dating specialist. So we're going to start with Dave, so 5 minutes only, please, Dave.
Okay, thank you, Duncan. Hi, Nick and Rachel. Folks, it's an interesting area. I won't get into the genetics and, population things. We know there's movement and genes over time. I'm more about people and relationships, and certainly as an Indigenous archaeologist. So for me, and talking to elders, we say our communities, as we know, archaeologically dated, going back 65,000, potentially more, is forever. And so Indigenous elders and communities talk about, this is our country and we've always been here. So for me, dates are sort of irrelevant. It's just getting the recognition of Indigenous ownership, custodianship, connection, spirituality and connection to country, which I think the world would benefit from, having a notion of self and the world. But I also think it's important that the debates are there, and that's caused controversy within the archaeological discipline. But the other way of looking at it is, as a discipline, Western science or European, very much Eurocentric notions of who these people are. We need to put everything in a bracket. But let's reverse that and go, our Western science, and where do you come from? You're here, you identify here. Who is your great-grandmother? Oh, you don't know? Oh, I don't really know. So we can have a debate about, well, hey, we've been here forever. Where are you guys from? You've been here the last 5 minutes, and we all questioning, we have to fit our worldview into yours. And I think that's an issue, dating all that. There's very many angles, but I think we need to also look at, hang on, we're here. Let's use that as the baseline. And you newcomers can fit in later, as you like.
I like it. Yep. Okay, so we might ask Rachel to give her perspective on first Australians.
Okay, so in contrast to Dave, I'm obviously obsessed with dates and timing and chronology. And I guess for me, that's because it tells us a little bit about kind of who these people were. So the first Australians, or the first dates that we have for people in Australia are from, at the moment it's the earliest site is Majabebe up in Arnhem Land, and that's where this date of 65,000 comes from. It's extremely controversial. It was only dated a few years ago, so people are still arguing about it. My conservative view, though, is that it's before 50,000, anywhere between about 55 and 65,000, because they dated the sediment rather than actually the stone tools that were in there, and that's the age of this, or the age range within that sedimentary package. And just to put that in a little bit of context about Western Europeans, perhaps, that's before modern humans got to Western Europe. So we have people in Australia that were definitely modern human. There's no serious argument about that, before modern humans got to Western Europe. So that's really quite cool. So yes, I agree, you have essentially been here essentially forever in that sense. Okay, so if we take a broader perspective then and say, well, what's going on outside of Australia at this point? Who were these people who crossed into Australia? We have very, very little evidence. So again, and it's very controversial. So most people, I think now, would say that modern humans are leaving Africa at around 60,000, potentially earlier than 60,000. And then they're potentially getting into Asia almost immediately. So we have dates of about that kind of age, potentially in Asia. And when we, and then, so very rapid then movement into Australia, if you take that kind of viewpoint. But this is mainly based on skeletal evidence. We don't have a huge amount of archaeology. We do start to see more archaeology in the 40,000s. So at about the same time that people are in Australia, we're starting to get an archaeological record emerging in Southeast Asia. This is through work of, say, Sue O'Connor in archaeology and natural history. And these people are, or at least she's finding a lot of evidence for exploitation of the marine resources. So we've got lots of fish occurring. These people are using shells to make ornaments. And we know for sure that to get to Australia, they would have had to have used a boat, and they were skilled navigators. Modelling suggests that they couldn't have just drifted across. So we've got a very complex and very society living in Southeast Asia, and these were the people that came into Australia and then continued to innovate when they got to Australia. So, for example, at Majabebe, we've got the earliest evidence of groundstone axes. Yeah, so that's my take on it. Lots and lots of debates going on about timing and everything, and I think that timing is quite key.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah.
Can you say it's all?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
So everyone's keeping very much to time. In fact, a bit short. So this is wonderful. It means that you can extrapolate.
I'll gobble up that extra bit of time. Yeah.
So what do languages tell us about this?
I've got to say from the start, languages don't directly tell us about dates unless they're written down, like Sumerian or something. But what they can tell you is the really detailed family tree profile of different groups. And if you think of it in terms of a family tree, you've got your brothers and sisters. From English, that's something like German and Dutch. And then your cousins, and you go out to your second cousins, like Bengali or Hindi. They're related to English. And probably that's about 7,000 years ago that they parted company. Now, linguists, you do that by looking at similarities of grammar, of words, and so on. Now, linguists have thought that the oldest language families in the world are about 10,000 years old by these methods. Australia is the only continent where all the languages appear to be related, of everywhere in the world. It's quite remarkable. Not everyone agrees with me, but I think that's the emerging consensus that all Australian languages belong to the one family. And my view is that we are talking about an incredibly old family.
And that should be surprising.
It should. It aligns exactly what Indigenous people say. Now, some of the debates and misunderstandings come around because imagine your big family. You've got a big family gathering with, people you don't really know how you're related to them. Some great-great-great-great-great-grandparent had some kids, and on it goes, and there's this like seventh cousin you don't know. Now, there's a small family who, let's call them the Joneses, and a small tight-knit group. Somehow they got their hands on a lot of real estate, and they just spread everywhere. And in Australia, there is such a branch that we call Pama-Nyungan, after the word for Pama, which is just person, up in Cape York, and Nyunga, which is person down in the southwest. And for reasons we don't understand, that's spread out over 7/8 of the continent. But that's not an unrelated family. It's just one branch nested into the big family that got lucky somehow. And that's one of the great questions for Australian historical linguistics and just Australian archaeology. What happened there? We don't know exactly when, but maybe mid-Holocene. We think it's probably got to do with a huge growth in relatedness, and interconnectedness, ability to stage ceremonies, ability to bring people together, maybe feed people through ceremonial foods or whatever it is, but that's still speculation. And the other big question is, how can it be that on this continent the languages kept the evidence of their relatedness so far back in time? In a way, it's lucky they have structures that are complex enough that the evidence survives well. It's just like if you're an archaeologist, there's good sites and bad sites for do stuff. It may be that there were cultural factors that enable people to conserve their languages better, but that's the thing that makes Australia very special. So as a linguist, you look at all Australian languages, including the one in the Western Torres Strait, not the Eastern Torres Strait, and it's just very, very clear that they are related, and you get words going across, often with little slippages of meaning. So, for example, the word gabal, which means a clearing in the rainforest in general, just near Cairns, and then you go to Kaidal, which is where I worked on Mornington Island. Kapar is a floodplain, a clay pan, and then you go out to close to where you were talking about before, Munbebe, and it's like a floodplain there, and it's a floodplain on Croker, Kapar. But that word, people were walking around this continent tens of thousands of years ago, referring to some sort of open space by that word. And what linguistics allows us to do is to compare words across languages and reconstruct back to those ancestral words and try and work out what they meant.
Oh, wonderful. So maybe we can just discuss about, so there were two things that... No, we don't have time for that, but yeah, nice of you to ask. So are these differences reconcilable? So we had there's different views about we've been here forever, and we've also got the view that Rachel was talking about there that, we know that there was this modern human arrival, so coming out of Africa.
Absolutely.
Yep, so you would say...
Yeah, this is we've got different angles of our combined disciplines. My first point, Pamanungan, is that a white anthropologist word, an Indigenous word that you provide for that language group? Which is lovely recognition.
The challenge was to name language families when the Indigenous traditions were to name varieties, right? But so then there weren't traditional words for those things.
No.
And the idea was, well, let's get a word from the two extreme ends, Pama and Nyunga, and there's also a tradition of naming language families after the word for person in that.
But there's a relationship based on peoples rather than like a biological analysis of categories.
It's based on what people call themselves. Yeah. And often it means human being and also man, and often it just means Aboriginal person as well. The exact meaning range varies a bit.
Yeah. So my last point is, and for the students, is so in terms of how we have this debate, and it's exciting, and we need all this, what makes this disciplined area of study. But it's also, I bring back moral arguments about our people, and we also need to look at the discussion and how it's coming, how we're fit. We're not just objects. The linguists are so vital to our revitalisation of our boundaries, etc., and a whole many. But it's about understanding and respecting, so that we're not actually just objects, collective language groups. I think, Rachel, with the dating side, it's still parts of it. It's very important. We don't need dates to justify who we are and our grandmother. I'm not saying against Rachel there, because this is really important, because it exposes our discipline to the rest of the world in how other people can relate to Indigenous peoples. Majabibi, that axe that was found, the stone that was at 65,000, that was made by someone who's the local custodians today is their ancestor. My last point on all this, and why it's tied in, Western notions of time are linear, and here we go like this, whereas Indigenous is contemporaneous. So I say the stolen gen trauma is active today. It's not just a thing of sorry, but our commitment and cultural obligation to our ancestors, our lands and our kids and our future and our ancestral remains, whether it's 10,000, 20, 30, 50, as stated by Western science, is irrelevant to our cultural obligation. So those researching, studying and working with us within our system older than anyone else's, we need to have that debate. I think is still important for students studying, those researching us, and even those governing us, so we're not having juk and gore, which is there's a basis of respect. And that is where I see an ethical and harmonious multi-discipline, which will benefit all Australians in our knowledge of Australia's rich ancient history.
So basically, first Australians, we could say that they're actually here today. So it's
not the Western disciplines that have come. That's how I answer. But thank you very much.
Well, don't be too mean to the Western disciplines.
Well, I mean, it's not. I mean, it's there, but let's talk about. Let's have some truth telling in Australia, and let's have some, not flesh on the bone. We have communities and elders and connection to country. However, one thing I will throw at it, we're only just starting the tip of the iceberg about our knowledge of this, and that's why I love being part of this discipline. And I guess my role has been also trying to help ethically improve it. But we have great researchers and great work, and I think we are coming together.
And something else that, thanks Dave, that's fantastic. Something else that came up that it's really interesting, isn't it? This Pamanyungan, non-Pamanyungan language, the division, and also how it replicates with stone artefacts as well, potentially. So, do you think, and this is probably just a wild theory, but is it possible that the non-Pamanyungan languages, which are all in that northern portion of Australia, is that an enclave of that are descending from that very early way into Australia, do you think?
Yeah, so there's a general principle in linguistics that if you don't know anything about dates, but you're wanting to say where did all of these migrations and movements start out from, you look for the zone of greatest deep time diversity. That is where they are the most sort of differentiated groups. And that leads you up to basically a zone from Maningrida in the east down to the Bonaparte Gulf. So that sort of stripe from Maningrida across the Dale River floodplains down to the sort of Daly River. We couldn't say exactly which is the most diverse, but it's certainly bang smack inside it, which is also a sort of really interesting thing to see.
Absolutely. And throwing back to Rachel, the discussion that's really opening up to the world can't have been here, couldn't have got there without the excitement and announcement of the dates that we have. I mean, people ask me for comment all the time on the new dates. So I'm not negative to the process of that, it's just, having it together and having our elders as being the key. But, where do we go from here, Rachel, in our dating? I mean, are we now at the cap? Are we at the end of as languages are diminishing here? My thing is always we can go back and date a stone, but we can't recreate our languages that are lost.
Can I just pick that point up on that?
Maybe very briefly.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So dates, all they do is tell you when people were there, right? And what we would really love to know is how people lived and what changes there were in how people lived. I'll give you one little example of how linguistic reconstruction can help you here. This doesn't go all the way back to the earliest times, but it works in one area around southwestern Gulf of Carpentaria. So all the local groups there have a custom that you can't mix land and seafoods on a one fire. So if you eat fish, you don't put yams on the same fire, you have them as separate meals. Also, you shouldn't go out on the sea if you're menstruating as a woman. Nowadays, you shouldn't take mosquito repellent or something out because that will anger the rainbow serpent. Now, there's a word for that custom, which in Ladle is Malkarija, and in Kaido is Malkarij, and we can reconstruct back to the ancestral language of that family that we call Tanka.
Wow.
A word, Malkarija, which means that. So there's one little bit of the culture. That's not all the culture, but it's one little bit that we can take back in a very concrete way. Now, it's an interesting question to the archaeologist. Can you work out ways of doing this by, like looking at paths and things and seeing what gets put together and so on? But it's there that by getting together, all of a sudden we go from this, very, silhouette-like view of the past to a multicolour Metro Goldwyn Mayer version where you just see way more.
But the respect in that study is both the recognition of the elders and their knowledge, contemporary as well as in the past, but also the appreciation of that knowledge and how you as academics fit that together. There's still respect at the end of wow.
Absolutely.
And we're like, and I think that's important in our disciplines, just to focus how we think and how we act, and it's all about respect.
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
Rachel, did you want any closing statement?
Just to say that, I completely agree. Number one, when you're dating something, you are dating something. The date is not by itself being anything. You're actually dating something. So I know in the case of fireplaces, I think at the Willandra Lakes, you do find hearths with different things in them, and we can date them all to the same time period, within a few hundred years kind of thing. So you do see things like that, which is really exciting when you said that. I was like, oh. And I agree with Dave in terms of the most interesting thing that I find is when you, when I work with an archaeologist who works very closely with an indigenous elder who's helping them to interpret the the charcoal which is what I would normally work on, and tell them why they're getting this type of charcoal in that hearth. That's absolutely fascinating. That's, you know.
And the other thing is that elder is allowing them to work on his country, his site, his heritage.
It's incredible.
And you know, and that's the thing. But that's it, what is exciting, and there is greater involvement. Community archaeology is on partnerships with universities and in our discipline. It's wonderful.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that one, and I think that's a wrap.